Hey there, language enthusiasts. Ready for a deep dive? This one's a bit different. We're tackling a YouTube video. Learn English with podcasts. Yeah, you heard that right. It's a podcast about learning English with podcasts through a video. Kind of meta, right?
It's like those funhouse mirrors, but for language learning. Seriously, though, this setup's great. We get to analyze their advice and how they present it. Might even uncover some universal language learner struggles along the way. What stood out to you initially?
Honestly, the whole figuring out your English level thing, they break it down, beginner to advanced, but how accurate are we at self-assessment? It's easy to be too hard on yourself or not even realize how far you've come.
Right. They mentioned grasping like 60–70% of a conversation means you're maybe intermediate.
Yeah.
In my experience, it's a start, but language is more complex than that. Comprehension's key, sure, but fluency, vocabulary, grammar, think of it like, you know the rules of basketball. Doesn't make you LeBron James. Gotta practice.
Love that analogy. Okay, so we know our level, hopefully, but then comes actually speaking the language. I had this student once completely froze mid-conversation. Grammar overload. Ever happen with yours?
All the time. Fossilization is a term for it. Too much focus on grammar early on can actually hinder fluency. It's like learning to ride a bike but obsessing over each pedal stroke. You'll never enjoy the ride.
Now you're making me want to go for a bike ride. Okay, point taken. So if grammar's not the be-all, end-all, what'd this video suggest?
It's something I'm a big advocate for. Reading. Tons of it. But, and here's the kicker, don't get hung up on understanding every single word. It's more about context clues, like a detective piecing together the story.
Huge fan of that approach. And honestly, with digital readers now, if a word's really tripping you up, tap it, get the definition, move on. No need to be a walking dictionary from day one.
Exactly. It's that balance. Challenge yourself, but keep it enjoyable. Which, funny enough, leads into their next point.
Active listening. They're really big on the link between listening and speaking skills, which, duh, makes sense. Can't respond well if you haven't actually absorbed what's being said. It's like they say, 2 ears, 1 mouth.
Right. And active listening's more than just hearing sounds, It's engaging, deciphering, connecting the dots. Neurologically, too, that auditory input's building pathways in your brain, making communication smoother.
Whoa, we're rewiring our brains here. I love it. Okay, let's get practical. They had a bunch of self-study tips. Some I found super intriguing. Ever suggested talking to yourself to practice?
Surprisingly effective, even if it's just your houseplants. By vocalizing in English, your brain's working in that language. Strengthens those pathways we talked about.
Mental boot camp for language skills. I like it. They also said record yourself speaking, which, yeah, pinpoint those areas to improve, like a personal language coach in your pocket.
It's great for that. Pronunciation, intonation, pacing.
Speaking of which, they touched on shadowing, and I think it deserves more than a quick mention. Yes, glad you brought that up. Sounds equal parts cool and terrifying, like becoming someone's vocal twin. Thoughts? How can our listener even start with shadowing?
So, less mimicry, more vocal workout. You're training your mouth to make those English sounds naturally.
Like a vocal echo. I can see how that helped internalize the flow. You know, it's funny, this shadowing, mimicking, it's how we learned our first language. No grammar books, just pure immersion, copying what we hear. Think there's something to that, tapping back into that.
100%. And this video, it kind of touches on that indirectly. When they say don't get bogged down by grammar, especially early on, they're advocating for organic learning, communication first, grammar details later.
Right, like you're not going to nail a pirouette on your first try, right? You've got to feel the music first.
Exactly. Embrace those early fumbles. Even pro dancers were once tripping over their own feet.
Reminds me of their point about reading for enjoyment. It's tempting to obsess over every word, but sometimes you just got to let the story sweep you away.
Imagine exploring a new city. You wouldn't stop to analyze every brick, would you? It's about the atmosphere, the vibe. Reading's the same. Immerse yourself. Let the language wash over you.
And maybe grab a snack along the way. Okay, but seriously, with so much to read out there, how'd they suggest choosing? Especially when your English is still, in progress.
That's where your own interests are key. Mystery lover, historical fiction buff. Start with what you gravitate towards in general. Tons of English options out there. And hey, adapted books, those graded readers, can be a nice stepping stone if you're feeling overwhelmed.
Love those graded readers, it's true. Built-in support system. Speaking of which, the video is big on goal setting, something we advocate for too, of course. Any goal, really, language or otherwise. It helps to have those milestones.
Totally. Goals are your compass. Without them, language learning can feel like wandering without a map.
But they can also feel impossible if they're too big, right? I want to be fluent is daunting.
Which is why the video's smart. Keep your goals realistic, achievable. Instead of fluent, maybe it's have a 5-minute chat about my hobbies, or read a chapter of an English novel this week.
Smaller bites. I like it. It's that saying, journey of 1,000 miles.
Begins with a single step, or in our case, a single word, a phrase, a conversation.
Nicely put. And it's
Yeah.
not always a straight line, right? There'll be plateaus, detours. Don't get discouraged if you hit those. Just gotta keep moving, even if it's slow.
Progress over perfection. Even those stuck moments are chances to learn. What tripped you up? How'd you handle it? What would you do differently next time?
Turn those failures into feedback. I like it.
Yeah.
Speaking of feedback, remember that record yourself speaking tip.
Oh, yeah, I can hear the listeners cringing, but it is useful. Why is it so weird hearing our own voice recorded, even in our own language?
Right.
Yeah.
It's like we're so used to the version inside our heads, the recording sounds alien, but that difference can be, like, eye-opening.
Exactly. Like having a coach pointing out where your pronunciation could improve or where you stumble. Be kind to yourself, though. It's not about being harshly critical.
Self-compassion is key. Okay, before we wrap up this part of the deep dive, you mentioned how learning's not one size fits all. The video touched on this, but deserves more attention, I think.
For sure. Finding what works for you is huge.
It's like finding the perfect jeans, right? Not every style suits everybody.
100%. And the cool thing is, there is no right answer. Classrooms work for some, apps for others. Some people just dive headfirst into books and movies. It's about experimenting.
Your own language learning toolkit, you build it as you go. Speaking of which, the video talked about surrounding yourself with the language, that immersion idea.
And yeah, well, a trip to London's ideal. Not everyone can just hop on a plane,
Yeah.
but you can create immersion without leaving home.
Okay, so no plane ticket required. What are some ways our listener can bring that English-speaking world to them?
Well, remember, they mentioned online communities. That's huge. It's like a global network of English speakers right there, ready to chat, practice.
A virtual English-speaking cafe. And let's not forget movies, TV shows. Who hasn't picked up phrases from binge watching?
Right. It's like accidental cultural immersion, especially if you're paying attention to how people talk, the slang.
Sneaking in, learning with your entertainment. I like it. You know, one big thing I'm realizing through this deep dive, learning a language doesn't have to be scary, intimidating. It can be fun.
Exactly. That enjoyment, it's what keeps you going, even when things get tough.
It's about the journey, awkward moments and all, those aha moments when it clicks, the connections you make with the language and with people.
Beautifully said. And it all matters, every chat, every new word, like building a bridge brick by brick.
Love that. So as we wrap this up, find your own language learning joy. Maybe it's a good book, an online community, or just challenging yourself to a quick conversation. Every step counts. Until next time, happy learning.
It's true. It's true. And while we're on the topic of finding what works, the video also briefly talked about surrounding yourself with the language, immersing yourself in those English-speaking environments.
Yeah, and while, sure, a trip to London would be amazing, that's not exactly an option for everyone, right? The good news is you can totally create those immersive experiences right at home.
Okay, so for our listeners who aren't planning a transatlantic flight anytime soon, what are some ways to bring a bit of that English-speaking world into their, living room?
Well, remember that tip about joining online communities? That's a great place to start, I think. It's like having this network of English speakers all over the world right at your fingertips, ready to chat, practice, share their culture. It's like having a virtual English-speaking cafe right on your laptop. And hey, let's not forget about the power of movies and TV shows either. I mean, who hasn't binge-watched a show and then, suddenly they're using phrases from it in everyday conversation?
Exactly. It's true. Movies and TV shows, they're like these little cultural immersion crash courses, especially if you're really paying attention to the dialogue, the slang, all those nuances.
It's like sneaking in some learning while you're enjoying your favorite shows, you know? You know, one of the biggest takeaways I'm getting from this whole deep dive is that learning a language doesn't have to be this big, scary, overwhelming thing. It can be fun.
Right. It can be.
It can be about exploring your interests, connecting with people, discovering new ways of expressing yourself.
Absolutely. And that sense of playfulness, that joy in the process, that's so important. It's what keeps you coming back for more,
Yeah.
even when you hit those bumps in the road.
It's all about embracing the journey, right? Stumbles, triumphs, those awkward silences, those aha moments when everything just clicks. It's about the connections you make along the way with the language and with people.
Beautifully said. And remember, every little interaction, every conversation, every new word you learn,
Mm-hmm.
It all adds up. It all
It
matters.
does.
It's like you're building a bridge, brick by brick, conversation by conversation towards fluency.
What a fantastic analogy. So, as we wrap up this deep dive, we encourage you, our listeners, to find what sparks that joy for you in language learning. Maybe it's curling up with a good book, joining a lively online community, or even just challenging yourself to have a short conversation in English. Every step, no matter how small, brings you closer to fluency, to understanding another culture. Until next time, happy learning, everyone.